If you've ever seen the movie Coco, you might remember a scene where families are in a cemetery and they're leaving food and drink on the graves of their loved ones. It's a tradition that has roots going all the way back to the Aztecs. And so today I'm going to make one of the most common offerings, pan de muerto. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as I make pan de muerto using a recipe from 1938, this time on Tasting History. The Mexican holiday Dia de Muertos, or Day of the Dead, can actually last a few days, but usually it is observed on November 1st and 2nd and serves to honor deceased loved ones and some believe to reunite the souls of the dead with the living. There are numerous traditions associated with the holiday, but one of the most famous is the leaving of food and drink on the graves of loved ones or on the ofrenda, a sort of altar built to honor them. And I can think of no better offering than a sweetbread called pan de muerto. An estimated 30 million pieces of this bread are eaten in Mexico between October 30th and November 2nd and can vary in both recipe and shape. There are hundreds of ways to make this bread, but one of the most common versions that you'll see today is actually described in a recipe from 1938. It comes from Josefina Velázquez de León's cookbook Repostería Selecta, or Select Pastries. It is a very long recipe, so I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I will read a few passages as we go through the baking. But first, the ingredients. What you'll need is 4 cups or 500 grams of bread flour, 1.5 tablespoons or 14 grams of dried yeast, 2 eggs plus 5 yolks, 2/3 cup or 130 grams of sugar, 8 tablespoons or 113 grams of butter, and 8 tablespoons or 113 grams of lard. She's big on lard in all of her recipes, but you can just use all butter. It's not going to make a huge difference. 2 tablespoons of orange blossom water, 2 teaspoons of orange zest, 1 teaspoon of anise, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 1 more egg to attach the decorations. So first, make a starter by mixing the dried yeast with a 1/2 cup or 120 milliliters of lukewarm water and about a 1/2 cup or 60 grams of the bread flour. Mix it all together, then cover it and set it aside for about 25 to 30 minutes. And while it sits, she says to cook a teaspoon of anise grains and 6 tablespoons of water. Simmer for 2 minutes. Remove the mixture, strain it, and let it cool. So add the anise to 60 milliliters of water and set over a medium heat and bring it to a simmer for about 2 minutes. Then pour it through a sieve and let the water cool. Then add the salt and sugar to the remaining flour and whisk them in along with the orange zest. Once the starter dough has become nice and puffy, add it to the flour mixture along with the 2 eggs and the 5 yolks and the orange blossom water and the cooled anise water. Mix this either by hand or using the paddle of a stand mixer on low until all of the ingredients have come together to form a dough. Then switch to a dough hook and knead the bread for 10 to 12 minutes or until it has come together and pulls away from the sides of the bowl. Then we're going to start adding in the butter and the lard, and we're going to do it slowly, and it is going to become very, very sticky. This may be the stickiest dough I've ever worked with, so yes, you can do it by hand, but no, you should not do it by hand. If you have a stand mixer, now's the time to use it. So on a low speed, add a few tablespoons of butter or lard, and then let it knead in, and once it's incorporated, add a few more tablespoons, and repeat until all of the butter and lard are well incorporated into the dough. Then go back to kneading the bread on medium-high for another 10 minutes. After about 10 minutes, it should become a nice smooth dough, but it is still going to be really, really sticky, and you're going to be tempted to put some more flour into this. Don't, just let it be a sticky dough. Once it's come together, put it in a lightly greased container and allow it to rise for about 2 hours or until it's doubled in size. Then turn the dough out onto a lightly greased surface, fold it over on itself, and then return it to the container, cover it, and let it sit overnight. Now she says to let it sit for 6 to 12 hours at room temperature, but she must have a very, very cold house because it will just go crazy if it's left at like 75 or 80 degrees. So I would put it in the refrigerator overnight and then let it raise back up to room temperature the next morning. Either way, once it's had plenty of time to rise, punch it down and turn it out onto a lightly greased surface, and you can divide it into as many pieces as you want. She's not specific. I'm doing 4 rather good-sized loaves, but you can do like 2 really big ones or 8 or 16 smaller ones. But she also says to decorate with bones and tears which are made from the same dough and stick with egg. Like I said, there are many, many ways to shape this bread, this pan de muerto, but this is one of the most common, with little strips of dough that are supposed to symbolize bones and then one in the center, which many people have different ideas of what that symbolizes. She says it's a tear, so we're going with a tear. So take about 300 grams of dough and set it aside for the decoration, and then divide the rest into 4 pieces or however many loaves you want to make. Shape each piece into a ball, and then press them down gently on a lined baking sheet to make them flatter on top. Then take the remaining dough and make 4 small balls, or tiers, which will go on top of the bread, and roll out the remaining dough into 4 long ropes, about twice the size of each of the large loaves, and divide those into 4, rolling the center of each to be a little thinner than the ends to give them the appearance of bones. And it's more just the suggestion of bones. Honestly, it's going to lose a lot of its shape in the baking anyway, so if it doesn't exactly resemble a femur, that's okay. Then take that final egg and whisk it with a little water and brush just a bit onto each of the bones and set them in a cross on the top of the loaves. Then do the same with the tier, setting it in the center of the loaf and pushing it down firmly to make sure it stays put. Then cover the loaves and let them rise for about another 90 minutes or until they have doubled in size. I started with all 4 on one tray. They do double in size, so I ended up having to split it up into 2 trays, give them plenty of room to grow. Once they've doubled in size, brush them lightly with the remaining egg and water mixture, then set the loaves in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius and bake for another 20 to 25 minutes. It's obviously going to depend on how big your loaves are. Mine took about 23 minutes. And while they bake, make sure you are subscribed to Tasting History so you never miss an episode where you'll learn things like the origins of Dia de los Muertos. As with most holidays, the origins and traditions surrounding Dia de los Muertos are a medley of different traditions and celebrations that preceded it, some from Europe and some from pre-Columbian Mexico. Its pre-Columbian roots grew from the traditions of the Aztec, Toltec, and other Nahua civilizations. Now, to begin to understand some of their traditions surrounding the death of a loved one, it's important that we know a bit about how they regarded death. And to sum up the feelings of an entire civilization on a certain topic is not easy to do, maybe impossible to do, especially when most of their writings were destroyed. But there is a poem from Nezahualcóyotl, the 15th century pre-Columbian ruler of Texcoco, that shows that the inevitability of death was not something to be feared, but rather to be accepted as another part of life. Even jade will shatter, even gold will crush, even quetzal plumes will tear. One does not live forever on this earth, only for an instant do we endure. Now, just because death was not something to be feared doesn't mean that it wasn't something to be mourned, especially when it was the death of a loved one. And the Aztecs specifically had a very specific way of mourning their dead. After someone died, they would mourn them for 4 days each year, and only for 4 days for 4 years. They would weep, of course, but it was also more of a celebration of the person's life, with singing and dancing and eating their favorite foods. It actually sounds like a very healthy way to treat the subject. During those 4 years, the loved one would make their way to the final afterlife. And once those 4 years of mourning were over, there was no more mourning for that person ever. Remembering them, yes, but mourning them, no more. And for the most part, everyone did their mourning at the same time. It was done during 2 festivals, Micailhuitl, or Feast of the Little Dead, and Hueymicailhuitl, or Great Feast of the Dead. The first was held in early August and was meant to mourn the deaths of children, and the second was held 20 days later and meant to mourn the deaths of adults. And the mourning happened in conjunction with the celebrations of their lives. What's really cool is that we have descriptions of these events, both from Catholics who were watching from an outsider's perspective, but also several from Aztecs who were writing things down following the Spanish invasion of Mexico. For example, Aztecs who were writing for Friar Bernardino de Sahagún wrote, 2 days before the feast there was the seeking of flowers, and when they had been gathered, when it was dawn, then they were strung together, then they were twisted, they were wound in garlands. And when this was done, all the common folk together fell to making tamales for themselves. Tamales and flower garlands still being popular today during Dia de los Muertos. The flowers today are typically marigolds, which in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, were called Sempoaxochitl, which became the Spanish Cempasúchil. And they were the choicest flower offered to the god Huitzilopochtli. And after the offering, there was a massive feast with singing and dancing. And only the revered old men and the revered old women drank pulque. And he who became really drunk cried out at people or boasted of his manly deeds. Now today it's typically mezcal or tequila that makes one boastful of their manly deeds, and it's not just the old people It applies to everyone, I think. Now that is a wonderful description of the celebration, but there are also descriptions of the more somber moments during the festival. Each year, when they celebrated the Feast of the Dead, while the priests made sacrifices, everyone, each in his own house, climbed onto the terrace roofs of their houses, and looking toward the north at night, recited great prayers to the dead, each one to his ancestors. And speaking aloud, they said, "Come quickly, for we are awaiting you." This codex, which was written by a Spaniard, also describes aspects of the second festival which seem very familiar to the modern Día de los Muertos. During this month, they once again celebrated the Feast of the Dead, and it was bigger than the preceding one. The last 3 days of this month, all the living feasted in honor of the dead, and they went out to play in the country as a way of celebrating. During this feast, they made offerings to the dead, placing food and drinks on their tombs, which they did for 4 years, for they believed that during all this time, the souls had not yet gone to their place of rest, according to their belief. Now, in the study of religion, there is an idea called syncretism, and that is when a religion, a new religion, takes parts of an old religion and kind of brings them in to help bring people into the fold. Sometimes this is done very much on purpose, and sometimes it's just happenstance because it's human nature to keep doing the traditions that you've always been doing. But in this case of taking the food and putting it on the graves of the loved ones, at least according to the Franciscan friar Diego Duran, it was not something done by the Christians as a way to ease the transition into Christianity, but rather it was done by the Aztecs as a way to embed their practices into their new holidays of All Hallows and Day of the Faithfully Departed, November 1st and 2nd. And Friar Duran did not like that. I wish to refer to something I have seen take place on the day of All Hallows and on the day of the faithful departed. In some towns, offerings are made. When I asked why offerings were made on the day of All Hallows, I was told that this was in honor of the children, it being an ancient custom which had survived. I inquired whether offerings were also made on the day of the faithful departed, and the answer was yes, in honor of adults. I was sorry to hear these things because I saw clearly that the Feast of the Little Dead and the Feast of the Adults were still being celebrated. On the first I saw people offering chocolate, candles, fowl, fruit, great quantities of seed and food. On the next day I saw the same being done. Though this feast fell in August, I suspect that if it is an evil simulation, which I do not dare affirm, the pagan festival has been passed to the Feast of All Hallows in order to cover up the ancient ceremony. But the fact that Duran was so upset at their bringing offerings to the dead seems to be only because he made the connection between that practice and the now illegal festivals of the Aztecs, because it wasn't just the Aztecs who did it, the Spaniards did it as well. Often on All Souls' Day back in Spain, it was common to leave food, candles, and flowers on the graves of deceased loved ones, and surely that practice came across when the Spanish came to the New World. Another thing that they brought with them was the bread itself. Now, the Aztecs had bread, but it was very different from the bread that is pan de muerto today. Typically, their bread was an unleavened loaf made with corn or amaranth and was sweetened with honey. But it was the Spanish who brought the yeasted wheat loaf that was sweetened with sugar that we know as pan de muerto today. Now, both people would often form these breads into different shapes, like the Aztec papalo tlaxcali, which was a bread formed into the shape of a butterfly. But when it comes to the more common bone-shaped decorations that we see in the bread today, that likely came from the Spanish, possibly stemming from another food eaten on All Souls' Day called huesos de santos, or bones of the saints. These were and still are marzipan treats that are shaped into little bones, and they've been around for a very long time. One of the first mentions was in a 1611 cookbook by Francisco Martínez Motiño. Today the shape is a little less literal. It doesn't look exactly like a bone, but still it's usually an elongated cylinder that is white and often filled with something resembling marrow, though usually it's some sort of sweet custard made with egg yolk, and still today these are often left on the graves of deceased loved ones on All Souls' Day. Now, it's impossible to say if these really were the inspiration for the bone-shaped design on pan de muerto today, but it's clear that the Spanish who were coming over to America had no problem shaping food like body parts and leaving it on the graves of their loved ones, so very well could be. Like with most foods, it's impossible to pinpoint an exact origin of any aspect of it. Rather, it's an amalgam of many traditions and many foods that have come before it. It's why when it comes to pan de muerto, there is no one recipe or one shape to follow. There are so many, unless you're watching this show, which you are, in which case there is one recipe and it wraps up just like this. Once the bread is fully baked and the bottoms are golden brown, remove them from the oven and let them cool. And as they do, the recipe says to make a sugar glaze. Today that glaze is usually made with egg and sugar, very simple. Hers, a little less simple, but not too hard. What you need for that is 1 tablespoon of flour and a half cup or 120 milliliters of water. Then she says to dissolve flour in water, cook and keep moving continuously until it reaches a consistency of thick cream. So whisk the flour into the water and set it over a low heat and stir it until it thickens, about 5 or 6 minutes. And once it hits that consistency, take it off the heat, but keep stirring until it's fairly cooled, and then brush it onto each of the loaves and quickly dust them with a generous amount of sugar. Let them sit for about 5 minutes and then dust them once again with plenty of sugar, and they are ready for the ofrenda. And here we are, pan de muerto to offer up on Dia de los Muertos. It is a thing of beauty, I gotta say. It smells so good. Yeah, so sometimes when they rise, all the things go kind of wibbly, pieces fall off and whatnot, so you can kind of readjust while it's still hot, and they should do just fine. Look at that. Nice and fluffy, well baked, if I do say so myself. I'm gonna take this piece right here. That's fantastic. You really get the orange. That's what really hits you. The anise is very mild, which is good because I don't love anise. And it's nice because it does combat the sugar. I mean, there's a lot of sugar on top. But it's the orange that really comes through. And it's so soft and pillowy. Kind of reminds me of the texture of a Sally Lunn bun, which I did when I first started the channel and is still one of my favorite breads that I've ever made. Yeah, you should make these. If you like bread, and who doesn't like bread, I promise you, these are definitely worth making. A little bit of work. They got to sit overnight, but the flavor is fantastic. I'm going to put the recipe for this one down in the description because it is sort of complicated, and I'm hopefully going to have all of my recipes, or at least most of them, up on my website very soon, the Tasting History website, which I am working on with a little help from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the easiest way to design and build your new website. Their drag and drop tools and their new Fluid engine make it so simple. And with a huge selection of website templates, you can be sure your website is streamlined and easy to use. They have options for personal websites as well as for business websites. And if you are running a business, a Squarespace website is so intuitive for your customers. It's a seamless process for them to navigate your website, order your products, and then pay. And they've even integrated with Square so you can keep in-person sales synced up with orders and inventory for your online store. So if you're looking to make a website, go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you are ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/tastinghistory and get 10% off of your website or domain. And I will see you next time on Tasting History after I eat a lot of this bread.